I am convicted, but I am not a murderer. I did not murder my children. I did not attack myself.
For nearly 30 years, Darlie Routier has woken up inside a cell smaller than your bathroom. The same four walls, the same steel door, the same unbearable silence. This is the reality for Darlie Routier, a woman convicted of murdering her own son, who sits on Texas death row in a limbo that some say is far worse than death itself. But here's what will shock you: the conditions she endures, the events that have unfolded behind those prison walls, and the question that still haunts everyone. Is she actually innocent? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover about life on death row will change everything you thought you knew about the justice system. Before we dive into the nightmare that is Darlie's daily existence, let me tell you about one particular incident that happened in 2019, an incident that nearly broke her completely. But first, you need to understand how she got here. On June 6, 1996, Rowlett, Texas, a 911 call pierced the quiet suburban night. Darlie Routier was screaming and reported that an intruder had broken into her home and stabbed her two young sons. Devin, age 6, and Damon, age 5, were found dying from brutal stab wounds. Darlie herself had been stabbed in the neck and forearm. The scene was pure chaos, blood everywhere, a sock found down the alley, and a story that investigators immediately began to question. Within days, the narrative shifted. Investigators focused on inconsistencies in Darlie's story. 8 days after her son's funeral, she was arrested.
At approximately 10:20 p.m. this evening, investigators from the Rowlett Police Department arrested Darlie Routier.
The evidence presented seemed damning. No sign of forced entry, her wounds appeared superficial compared to the boys, and perhaps most controversially, surveillance footage of her spraying silly string on her son's grave during what should have been a somber birthday celebration. In 1997, she was convicted and sentenced to death.
A few weeks ago, 27-year-old Darlie Routier was convicted of murdering her 5-year-old son Damon and was sentenced to death by lethal injection.
But here's where it gets interesting. Her ex-husband, Darren Routier, who divorced her years later, still believes she's innocent. Appeals have been filed citing irregularities during the trial. DNA testing has been ordered and reordered as technology advances. As of 2024, those critical test results are still pending. And while the world debates her guilt or innocence, Darlie sits in a cell, waiting, always waiting. Now, let me tell you about the place that has become her entire world for nearly 3 decades. A place where women are sent to die slowly, one day at a time. The Patrick O'Daniel Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Previously known as Mountain View Unit, this facility houses up to 645 female inmates. But make no mistake, this isn't just another women's prison. This is where Texas sends women to death row. The death row section is separate from the general population, completely isolated. These women exist in a world within a world, cut off from almost everything and everyone. Darlie's cell is exactly 60 square feet. That's smaller than a standard parking space. In that microscopic space, she has a metal bunk, a combination toilet sink drinking fountain, a steel stool attached to a metal desk, and a single window. The solid steel door, heavy, and when it closes, it sounds like a tomb being sealed. This has been her home since 1997. The same cell, or one identical to it, for over 10,000 days. But the size of the cell isn't even the worst part. What really breaks prisoners isn't the space, it's what they don't have access to. And in 2015, something happened that showed just how desperate life on death row can become. It was a sweltering August day in 2015. Texas heat is brutal, and inside the prison, temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees. The prison's cooling system had been malfunctioning for weeks. Death row inmates, including Darlie, were confined to their cells with virtually no air circulation. The metal furnishings absorbed heat like an oven. Women were rationing their water, pressing wet towels against their skin, trying to survive. One inmate collapsed from heat exhaustion, then another. Medical staff were overwhelmed. Darlie later described feeling like she was being cooked alive slowly. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. The psychological torture combined with physical suffering pushed several inmates to the breaking point. Some began banging on their doors, screaming for help that was slow to come. This wasn't an execution, but it felt like one, just slower and more cruel. This incident sparked a lawsuit about cruel and unusual punishment, but for the women living through it, legal action was cold comfort when they were literally burning up in their cells. But if the heat nearly broke her body, what came next almost broke her mind. But extreme events like heat waves aren't the norm. Most days on death row are defined by something far more insidious: monotony. Darlie is allowed out of her cell to shower and for just 2 hours of recreation daily. 2 hours out of 24. The other 22 hours, she's locked in that 60-square-foot cage. She can work 4 hours if she chooses, doing prison jobs that pay pennies. Recreation time includes outdoor access, but only on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Imagine only seeing the sun twice a week. Meals are delivered through a slot in her door. She eats alone, sleeps alone, and exists alone. The silence is maddening. Other inmates report that the worst punishment isn't the threat of execution. It's nothingness. The endless, crushing nothingness of each identical day bleeding into the next. But Darlie found ways to cope, to maintain her sanity in an environment designed to break the human spirit. And then, in 2019, something happened that tested her resolve like never before. In October 2019, Darlie received news that DNA testing had been ordered once again. This wasn't the first time. Tests had been ordered in 2008, then again in 2018. Each time, hope surged through her veins like electricity. This could be it. This could be the evidence that proves her innocence. After more than 2 decades of maintaining that she didn't kill her children, science might finally vindicate her. She allowed herself to imagine release, seeing her surviving son, who was just an infant when she was arrested, now a grown man, walking outside without shackles, breathing free air. Other inmates in her unit noticed the change in her demeanor. She smiled more, participated more actively in the limited programs available to death row inmates.
I do crochet. I'm doing a Dallas Cowboys embroidery work and the crocheting for special projects.
She clung to hope like a drowning person clings to driftwood. Months passed, then a year, then 2 years. The results never came. Fellow inmates described watching Darlie slowly deflate as each month brought no answers. The psychological whiplash of hope dangled and then snatched away is a special kind of torture. It's the hope that kills you, one inmate said. The monotony you can survive. The hope that destroys you. As of 2024, those DNA results are still pending. Living with that kind of uncertainty while confined to such extreme isolation takes an unimaginable psychological toll. Darlie has engaged in various prison programs aimed at personal development and rehabilitation. She's taken educational courses, participated in counseling, and maintained correspondence with supporters. But these small acts of normalcy exist against a backdrop of absolute abnormality. She lives with a stigma that penetrates everything. She's the woman convicted of murdering her children. In the prison hierarchy, there's nothing lower. Child killers are despised even among criminals. She's isolated from the general population partly for her own protection. There are only a handful of women on Texas death row at any given time. These are the only people who truly understand her reality. They form bonds born of shared trauma, shared hopelessness, shared waiting for death. Mental health professionals who study death row inmates report that the conditions create a unique psychological syndrome: extreme anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, emotional flatness, and cognitive deterioration. It's called the death row phenomenon. Some argue that by the time a death row inmate is executed, they're not the same person who committed the crime. The isolation has destroyed who they were and created someone new, someone broken. Is this justice or is this torture? In 2021, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the prison went into extreme lockdown. Even the minimal freedoms death row inmates had were stripped away. No recreation time, no work assignments, no programs, no visits from attorneys or advocates. Nothing but the cell 24 hours a day, for weeks that stretched into months. Darlie was completely cut off. In a place where human contact was already severely limited, it became non-existent. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. One former corrections officer who worked during this period described hearing women screaming, crying, and begging for any form of human interaction. Some regressed completely, stopped maintaining basic hygiene, and stopped responding to guards. Darlie, according to sources close to her case, spent those months in what she described as a walking coma, going through motions without really being present, dissociating from a reality too painful to fully experience. When the lockdown finally eased, advocates reported that she seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. The spark that had kept her fighting for appeals, for DNA testing, for justice, it had dimmed. The pandemic lockdown wasn't life-threatening in the traditional sense, but it was soul-threatening. And for someone already hanging on by a thread, it nearly pushed her over the edge. While Darlie endures this existence, the outside world remains deeply divided about her case. Advocates point to numerous issues with her trial: questionable forensic evidence, potential prosecutorial misconduct, witnesses who have recanted or changed their stories, and that crucial DNA evidence that keeps getting ordered but never seems to materialize with results. Critics point to what they see as clear evidence of guilt: her behavior after the murders, the lack of evidence supporting an intruder, and the specific nature of the boy's wounds. Television documentaries have been made, books have been written, true crime podcasts dissect every detail. Online forums rage with arguments about her guilt or innocence. But while the world debates, Darlie sits in her cell. In 2024, she became eligible for parole. But for someone on death row convicted of capital murder, parole is essentially impossible without a conviction being overturned. So she waits for DNA results, for appeals to be heard, for parole she'll never get, for execution that could come any day, or for death to take her naturally after decades in these conditions. This brings us to the central question: is this worse than death? Texas executes inmates by lethal injection. The process, from entering the death chamber to being pronounced dead, takes approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes versus nearly 30 years in a 60-square-foot cell. Some death row inmates actually volunteer for execution, waiving their appeals, choosing death over continued existence in these conditions. They call it death row syndrome, the point at which an inmate decides that execution is preferable to life. Darlie hasn't reached that point. She continues to fight, continues to maintain her innocence, and continues to hope that DNA evidence will finally free her. But after nearly 3 decades of this existence, of watching other inmates be executed, of experiencing the heat, the isolation, the crushing monotony, the perpetual uncertainty, can we really call this living? Or is this something else entirely? A slow-motion execution that takes decades instead of minutes? A punishment that destroys the soul before it ever touches the body? Today, Darlie Routier is 54 years old. She spent more than half her life in that tiny cell. Her surviving son, Drake, who was just 7 months old when she was arrested, is now in his late 20s. He's lived almost his entire life with his mother on death row. The DNA results that could potentially prove her innocence or confirm her guilt remain in limbo. The justice system moves slowly, and nowhere does it move slower than in capital cases. Texas has executed more inmates than any other state. That death chamber is always ready. The question isn't if Darlie will face execution, it's when. Unless those DNA results or a successful appeal intervene, her fate is sealed. But until that day comes, she'll continue to wake up in that 60-square-foot cell. She'll continue to count the hours until her 2-hour recreation period. She'll continue to eat meals alone, sleep alone, and exist alone. She'll continue to live a life that many would argue is worse than death itself. Whether she's guilty or innocent, whether she deserves this or not, one thing is undeniable. What she's experiencing is a form of human suffering that most of us cannot begin to comprehend. And it raises uncomfortable questions about our justice system, about the death penalty, about punishment versus torture, and about what we, as a society, are comfortable inflicting on human beings, even those convicted of the most heinous crimes. The story of Darlie Routier isn't over. It continues every single day behind those prison walls, in that tiny cell, in the crushing silence of death row. What do you think? Is this justice? Is this humane? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to stay updated on cases like this, cases that challenge our understanding of justice and punishment, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.